The crosswalk signal flashed red, but she didn't move. A black woman stood alone in the tide of Manhattan rush hour. A small Korean boy pressed against her chest, both staring directly at the tinted window of a black luxury sedan. Inside, a man who had built an empire on perfect disappearances felt his pulse fracture. 3 years ago, he had signed the order himself, clean, final, irreversible. Yet here she stood, alive and unyielding, holding proof of a failure far more dangerous than survival. The child turned his head, and for one suspended moment, the man saw his own eyes staring back at him. She knew he was watching. 42nd Street didn't pause for anyone. The asphalt thrummed with heat rising through worn concrete, carrying the sharp tang of street vendor smoke and exhaust. Taxis honked in staccato bursts. Delivery trucks double-parked with hazards blinking. Tourists shuffled in confused clusters while locals cut through gaps that didn't seem to exist until bodies made them real. In the back of the sedan, he sat in manufactured stillness. Charcoal suit pressed sharp, hands folded over Italian leather, face schooled into the expression that had ended negotiations and lives with equal efficiency. The city reflected off tinted glass like a kingdom viewed from a throne. He owned nothing here officially. No deeds. No paperwork. No names attached to property or accounts that could be traced back to Seoul. Yet the dockworkers knew. The union bosses knew. The district attorneys who didn't ask certain questions knew. Power didn't require visibility. It required inevitability. The light ahead turned yellow. His driver eased toward the intersection, brake lights glowing red in the haze. Pedestrians gathered at the crosswalk in that unique New York formation. Bodies angled forward, weight shifting, ready to flood the street the instant permission arrived. That's when the world cracked. She stood 3 bodies deep in the crowd, but somehow occupied space differently than everyone around her. While others checked phones or stared into middle distance, her posture was a declaration. Spine straight, shoulders squared, chin level. Protective without being defensive. The boy was maybe 3 years old. Korean features set in a face still soft with childhood. He wore a gray cotton shirt with a small dinosaur stitched near the collar. One small hand gripped the woman's blouse. The other hung relaxed at his side. The child wasn't looking at the street. He was looking directly at the sedan. At him. The man's breath caught halfway down his throat and stayed there. His right hand, resting on the leather seat, tightened until knuckles went pale beneath skin. The carefully constructed stillness that governed every meeting, every negotiation, every execution of power. It shattered like glass under pressure. Impossible. The word repeated in his mind with the mechanical rhythm of denial. This was coincidence. Statistical anomaly. New York held 8 million people pressed into vertical corridors. Faces recycled. Features overlapped. The human brain manufactured patterns from chaos because that's what kept ancestors alive when shadows moved in firelight. But the boy's eyes didn't waver. They held steady with a quality that children weren't supposed to possess. Not curiosity, but assessment. The way you studied something you recognized but couldn't yet name. His own eyes staring back. The same almond shape. The same slight downward tilt at the outer corners. The same weight behind the gaze, as if even at 3 years old, this child understood that looking meant seeing, and seeing meant remembering, and remembering meant consequence. Genetic echo made flesh. The light turned green. Pedestrians surged forward in that collective release of urban momentum. She moved with them, each step deliberate. The boy's weight balanced against her hip. Not hurrying. Not hesitating. Coming closer. 20 feet. 15. Close enough now that he could see details that should have been impossible to remember but rose anyway from places memory wasn't supposed to reach. The exact angle of her jaw. The way she held tension in her shoulders without broadcasting fear. The intelligence in her eyes that he'd once mistaken for compliance. Jasmine Brooks. The woman erased 3 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon with a phone call that lasted 47 seconds. standing alive in Manhattan sunlight, holding his son. His driver glanced in the rearview mirror, catching something in his boss's expression that made words die before forming. In 20 years of service, he'd learned the hierarchy of silence. Some quiet meant patience. Some meant calculation. This silence felt like free fall. The boy shifted in her arms, turning his head to look up at her face. His lips moved. Question, probably. Something children asked 1,000 times a day in voices adults learned to filter out as background noise. But she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked straight ahead, straight at the sedan, straight at the tinted window, straight at the man behind glass who had authored her death and was now confronting the failure of his own omnipotence. Their eyes met, and she did not run. That single fact detonated every assumption he'd built his empire upon. Fear made people predictable. Survival instinct overrode loyalty, pride, even love. You could engineer behavior if you understood what people valued more than their own lives, then threatened to take it. But she stood still while chaos flowed around her. Pedestrians passed on both sides like water around stone. The crosswalk timer counted down in orange digits. Somewhere a siren wailed. A bicycle messenger shouted at a cab. She just stood there, 10 feet away now, close enough to see the boy's eyelashes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his fingers gripped fabric like an anchor point in uncertain water, close enough to see her face fully, older than memory held it, carved leaner by whatever 3 years of survival had cost. But the eyes unchanged. Still that particular shade of brown that looked almost black in shadow but caught gold in direct light. Still watching him with something worse than hatred or fear. Understanding. The man's hand moved to the door handle. He didn't remember deciding to move. Control was muscle memory, decision compressed into reflex. But this motion came from somewhere else entirely. Some part of himself he disciplined into submission decades ago when he learned that sentiment was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. His fingers closed around polished metal. And for the first time in 20 years, his head of security, standing on the curb 3 cars back, hesitated before reaching for the weapon concealed beneath his jacket, uncertain whether he was witnessing a threat that required intervention or something his training had no protocol for. A miracle, or a reckoning. The boy's eyes never left his face. That child had his eyes. No. The word left his mouth like a command that could reshape reality through sheer force of will. His driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Sir. He waved the question away without breaking his stare. The gesture was automatic silence enforced through muscle memory. Around him, his world had always bent to intention. Boardrooms cleared when he entered. Prosecutors reconsidered cases overnight. Men vanished between subway stops, and the city's indifference swallowed the absence whole. He had personally reviewed the Brooks file. Twice. Standard termination protocol, no spectacle, no message, just surgical removal of a complication. The lieutenant assigned was reliable. Former ROK military. 15 confirmed completions without incident. The system worked because he trusted nothing to chance. Yet across 10 feet of concrete and circumstance, statistical impossibility wore a gray shirt with a dinosaur on it. His mind reached for mathematics like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. 8 million people in New York. Thousands of biracial children. The human face constructed from limited variables, eye spacing, bone structure, ratios that repeated across populations with algorithmic predictability. Coincidence. It had to be coincidence. But the boy's posture, weight distributed on one hip, head tilted at precisely the angle he himself used when listening to subordinates lie, wasn't coincidence. That was inherited architecture. DNA expressing itself in gesture before language could teach it. The child shifted, wrapping both arms around her neck. Small fingers pressed into dark skin. Trust made physical. She still hadn't moved. Everyone else flowed past. Suits and tourists, delivery workers and street preachers. but she occupied space like a monument erected specifically for him to witness. No signs of flight preparation, no scanning for exits, no fear responses his trained eye could catalog and predict. That absence destabilized him more than her presence. In his world, survival meant motion. You ran or you fought or you negotiated, but you didn't stand still while the predator studied you through tinted glass. Standing still meant you'd already accepted the outcome. Or worse, it meant you believed you had nothing left to lose. His hand remained frozen on the door handle. Behind him, through the rear window, he sensed rather than saw his security details' confusion. They were reading him the way orchestras read conductors, waiting for the gesture that would transform potential into action. But the gesture wouldn't come, because opening that door meant choosing between the empire built on certainty and the child wearing his bone structure like evidence. Between the man who signed termination orders over breakfast and whoever stood on the other side of admission. The crosswalk timer blinked its final seconds. She adjusted the boy's weight against her hip, turned slightly, preparing to walk away, not fleeing, just leaving, as if his presence didn't warrant urgency, as if 3 years of survival had taught her that power only reached as far as you let it, and she'd simply stopped granting permission. The light changed. She took one step back toward the curb. His hand moved without authorization, pulling the handle, pushing the door open against its weighted hinge. Cool air rushed into the sedan's controlled environment. Street noise invaded the silence he'd wrapped around himself like armor. His head of security's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Sir, what are your—" He stepped onto the pavement. The city noise compressed into a single sustained note. Car horns, distant sirens, someone's radio bleeding bachata into the afternoon heat. All of it present but suddenly irrelevant, reduced to ambient pressure against the singular fact of proximity. 5 feet now. Close enough to see the boy's eyelashes were impossibly long. To notice the small cowlick disrupting his hairline in exactly the same place where his own barber compensated with product every morning. Close enough to confirm what logic kept trying to deny. She met his eyes without flinching, waiting. The question formed in his mind like a blade turning inward. If you were certain she was dead, why does seeing her alive feel less like surprise and more like relief? For years earlier, Jasmine Brooks had been hired to make problems disappear through syntax. Legal translator. Contract intermediary. The woman who could render Korean corporate language into English phrases that wouldn't trigger SEC investigations or Treasury Department algorithms. She was expensive, discreet, and had learned early that asking questions shortened careers. The first 3 months, she never saw his face. Documents arrived via encrypted email. Payment appeared in her account like clockwork. Professional distance maintained through digital barriers that both parties understood were necessary for survival. Then a shipping contract went wrong. Customs seized a container in Newark. Someone needed to explain maritime law to someone who didn't speak the language but absolutely controlled the outcome. She was summoned to a restaurant in Koreatown that closed its doors for private parties every Wednesday at 9. He sat alone at a table meant for 12. She'd expected theater, the performance of dominance that insecure men used like armor. But he just gestured to the chair across from him and asked if she preferred tea or whiskey. "Whiskey," she'd answered, meeting his eyes. "If we're pretending this is a business meeting." The corner of his mouth had moved. Not quite a smile. Something closer to recognition. That's when professional distance started eroding like shoreline against tide. 18 months later, late nights became the space where armor came off. She learned he'd killed his first man at 17. That his mother had died believing he'd become a doctor. That he could recite Yeats from memory but pretended not to understand poetry in front of his lieutenants. He learned she'd put herself through Columbia. That her father had been a minister who'd stopped speaking to her when she chose law over faith. That she played piano badly but obsessively when stressed. The night it happened, the irrevocable shift from professional to personal, started with bourbon and ended with vulnerability neither had planned to expose. Aftermath arrived 6 weeks later in a bathroom stall at her office, 2 pink lines rendering the future unambiguous. She told him in the same restaurant where they'd first met. He set down his glass with the careful precision of someone preventing spillage through sheer discipline. Are you certain? His voice was steady. Clinical. 3 tests. Yes. Silence stretched between them like a border neither knew how to cross. Finally, that child cannot exist. Not cruelty, just calculation. The same tone he used approving shipping manifests or personnel reassignments. I'm not asking permission, Jasmine said quietly. I'm not offering options. He met her eyes with something that might have been regret if men like him permitted such indulgences. You understand what this means. What exposure costs. She understood perfectly. 2 weeks later, the surveillance started. Black sedans trailing her commute. Her apartment buildings super asking questions about visitors. Bank accounts flagged for review by institutions that had never noticed her before. She recognized the architecture of erasure being constructed around her. The night they came, she wasn't home. Grocery run that saved her life through sheer timing. She returned to find her door ajar, belongings sorted into garbage bags. Lease somehow voided despite months remaining. She ran. Bus stations. Cash transactions. Disposable phones. The survival skills poverty had taught her repurposed for a different kind of war. The lieutenant found her in a motel outside Philadelphia. He was older than the others. Carried himself like someone who'd stopped believing in clean hands decades ago but still remembered what they'd felt like. He sat across from her in the parking lot, engine idling, and said, You have 2 choices. There's what I'm supposed to do, and there's a bus ticket to Atlanta in this envelope. Why? Her voice was steady despite her pulse. Because killing pregnant women wasn't in my contract when I signed up. He placed the envelope on the hood between them. Don't make me regret mercy. She gave birth alone in a clinic that didn't ask for insurance or proper identification. When they placed Daniel on her chest, warm and impossibly small, eyes unfocused but somehow searching, she made a promise louder than fear. You will know safety even if I never do again. Present day. You look exactly the same, he said finally, still standing 5 feet away on a Manhattan crosswalk. Liar. Jasmine's voice carried no accusation, just fact. You look older. Power ages poorly. So does survival. The boy stirred against her shoulder, watching this stranger with his father's eyes study them both like an equation that refused to balance. Why did you come back? He asked. Because running ends eventually, she answered. And he deserves to know why his face makes strangers stare. The question hung between them like smoke. Can you atone for ordering someone's death by failing to see it through? Or does mercy require something more expensive than restraint? His empire had been built on 3 immutable laws. Law 1, no lineage. Children were leverage waiting to be exploited. Hostages born with your face. Weakness advertised through biology. The old bosses had learned this the hard way. Sons kidnapped, daughters married off to rival factions, bloodlines turned into negotiating chips. He'd watched his own mentor buried beside the grandson who'd been returned in pieces. So he'd forbidden it. No families. No ifs. The organization would outlive individuals through structure, not succession. Law 2, no sentiment. Affection was permission for others to find your pressure points. Love made you predictable. Loyalty could be purchased, but emotion? Emotion made you vulnerable to the one weapon money couldn't neutralize, caring more about someone else's survival than your own. Law 3, no unfinished business. Threats were eliminated completely or not at all. Half measures bred resentment. Mercy created enemies with memory. Every loose end eventually became a noose. These weren't philosophical preferences. They were survival calculus written in the blood of men who'd miscalculated. And every single law had just shattered against the reality of a 3-year-old boy wearing his bone structure like testimony. The system had failed. Not spectacularly. Not through betrayal or incompetence. It had failed through the quiet rebellion of one aging lieutenant who decided some orders contradicted whatever remained of his soul. Standing here now, Manhattan afternoon pressing heat against his suit, Jasmine watching him with eyes that had learned to measure danger without flinching. He felt the architecture of certainty collapse inward. Fear arrived first. Not of exposure, though that was coming. Not of rivals smelling weakness, though they would. Fear that the relief flooding through him was louder than the panic. She was alive. The thought he'd disciplined into silence for 3 years suddenly inescapable. I didn't want her dead. Ordering it had been easy. Distraction made everything easy. Sign the authorization. Make the call. 47 seconds of conversation that translated intent into action while maintaining the necessary distance between decision and consequence. He'd done it dozens of times. The accountant who'd noticed irregular transfers and started asking questions his curiosity couldn't survive. The dock supervisor who'd tried leveraging what he knew into a percentage that wasn't negotiable. The prosecutor's assistant who'd gotten too close to connecting names that needed to remain separate. All necessary. All clean.
All permanent.
But their faces visited him in the hour before dawn when sleep thinned and discipline faltered. Not guilt exactly. Guilt implied regret, and regret implied alternatives he genuinely considered. No, what visited was something colder. The arithmetic of survival. The running tally of people who'd continued breathing only until their breath became inconvenient. Jasmine should have been another entry in that ledger. Instead, she stood here holding evidence that his control was always more fragile than he'd convinced himself. That systems built by men could be undermined by other men's last shreds of conscience. The boy shifted in her arms, and he saw it clearly now, the uncontrollable variable his entire philosophy had been designed to prevent. This child didn't care about organizational charts or threat assessments. Didn't understand that his existence made his mother a target and his father a liability. He just existed, innocent and absolute, a fact that couldn't be negotiated with or neutralized through strategy. "You're not going to say anything?" Jasmine asked quietly. His security detail was 3 cars back, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. Waiting for him to reassert control through the vocabulary of violence that had always been available when words failed. But the script had been written for a world where his laws held, where sentiment didn't compromise judgment, where lineage didn't create vulnerabilities, where business stayed unfinished only through oversight, never through mercy. That world had ended the moment a lieutenant chose compassion over compliance. And he'd been living in its ghost ever since, pretending the order's failure was somewhere else's problem, someone else's conscience, someone else's unfinished business. The boy was looking at him again, not afraid, not curious, just looking, the way you studied something familiar but unnamed, a reflection not yet understood. His reflection, his unfinished business, his failed law made flesh. If your rules were supposed to prevent this exact situation, and they failed, were they protecting you or were they just expensive ways of avoiding the question? What kind of man kills his own child to maintain an empire he'll die alone in anyway? The crosswalk timer reset. Fresh wave of pedestrians gathered at the curb. Jasmine didn't wait for the signal. She stepped into the street with deliberate precision, each footfall measured, the boy's weight balanced against her hip. Not fleeing, not rushing, just crossing the distance between survival and confrontation with the steady pace of someone who'd already made peace with whatever came next. 20 feet. He watched the child's profile, the slight upturn of his nose, his mother's feature softening the sharper geometry inherited from paternal genes. The way his small hand rested on Jasmine's collarbone, fingers splayed like a starfish. Trust without conditions. 15 feet. What would his life have looked like without the empire? Without the calculus that turned people into assets or liabilities? Would he have taught this boy to ride a bicycle? Helped with homework? Attended piano recitals with a camera phone and awkward pride? The questions felt like examining archaeological remains of a civilization that had never existed. 10 feet. The boy turned his head fully now, tracking him with unsettling focus. Children weren't supposed to maintain eye contact like this, steady and evaluating. They were supposed to hide behind parents' legs or wave with unfiltered friendliness. But Daniel, he knew the name now, had carried it in his chest like shrapnel since their last exchange. Just watched, absorbing, recording, processing information with an intelligence that shouldn't yet exist at 3 years old. 5 feet. Jasmine stopped. The city noise compressed into white static. Somewhere behind him, his head of security murmured into a radio. Strategic recommendations being calculated and transmitted. Perimeter assessments. Exit strategies. The machinery of protection operating on autopilot. But none of it reached him. "Why is that man staring at us?" Daniel asked quietly. His voice was clear, precise, each syllable articulated with care that suggested he'd been taught to make himself understood in environments where accent or hesitation might be misinterpreted as weakness. Survival skills inherited through instruction instead of DNA. Jasmine's jaw tightened. Not anger. Something closer to exhaustion from carrying weight too long. "Because," she said carefully, "he forgot something important a long time ago." What did he forget? That some decisions don't end when you stop thinking about them. The boy absorbed this with the seriousness children applied to truths they sensed mattered even when vocabulary failed comprehension. Then he looked directly at him again and asked, "Are you sad?" The question detonated. Not because it was perceptive, though it was cutting through decades of discipline to locate the exact feeling he'd been refusing to name, but because no one had asked him that in 20 years. Anger, yes. Fear occasionally. Respect constantly. But sadness? Sadness was the province of people who believed feelings deserved acknowledgement instead of suppression. His voice fractured, reset. "I don't know." Truth arrived unfiltered, unauthorized. The admission of someone who'd suddenly realized the performance of certainty had calcified into genuine confusion about what existed beneath the armor. Daniel nodded solemnly, as if adults confessing ignorance was perfectly normal. Expected, even. "My mama says it's okay to not know things," the boy offered. "But you have to ask questions to find out." Behind him, he heard his driver exit the sedan, protective instinct activating despite no visible threat. His security detail had shifted closer, 3 men in strategic positions, hands near concealed weapons, body language broadcasting preparedness for violence that situation couldn't yet justify. They were reading the encounter wrong, treating this like negotiation or ambush instead of what it actually was: collapse. The visible dissolution of the man who'd ordered their paychecks and their silence for years. Standing emotionally unarmed in the middle of Manhattan while a 3-year-old dismantled his worldview with questions about feelings. Jasmine's expression hadn't changed. Still that careful neutrality. The face of someone who'd learned to give nothing away because everything could be used against you. But her grip on Daniel had shifted. Protective hold loosening slightly. Not trust, she was too smart for trust. But maybe recognition that violence wasn't arriving on schedule. "I should go," she said finally, not asking permission, just announcing intent. He knew she was right. Every second of exposure increased risk. For her. For Daniel. For the illusion of control he needed to maintain if the Empire was going to survive past this afternoon. But his voice formed different words. "Wait." Single syllable. Command softened into request. She paused. "Waiting. If you let them walk away now, you preserve everything you built. If you don't, if you reach for connection instead of control, what remains of the man who chose empire over humanity?" And why does the answer suddenly feel less clear than it did 5 minutes ago? His phone vibrated against his ribs. Once, twice. The pattern coded for priority communication from Seoul. He didn't move to answer it. Jasmine's eyes tracked the subtle shift in his posture. The way his shoulders tensed, how his jaw set differently. She'd learned to read danger the way sailors read weather. Small atmospheric changes predicting storms still below the horizon. You should take that, she said quietly. It can wait.
No.
Her voice sharpened. It can't. And you know it. The phone stopped. Started again immediately. Sol didn't call twice unless blood was already in the water. He pulled the device from his inner pocket. The screen displayed a name that made his pulse spike despite years of discipline. Park Min-jun, his second in command. The man who only contacted him directly when the organizational equivalent of fire demanded immediate attention. He answered in Korean. Listened. His expression remained neutral, but something behind his eyes shifted. Calculation replacing the vulnerability that had been surfacing moments before. When? He asked. The response made his free hand curl into a fist. Contain it. I'll call back in 30 minutes. He ended the call. Looked at Jasmine with an expression she recognized from late nights 4 years ago, when problems arrived that couldn't be solved with contracts or conversation. We need to move, he said. Now. What happened? Rumors. Someone in Seoul is asking questions about an heir. About why I've redirected funds through third-party accounts. About a woman and a child in New York. Jasmine's face drained of color. How long have they known? They don't know. Not yet. But they're looking. And in my world, suspicion accelerates into certainty faster than truth can catch up. Daniel sensed the shift in his mother's tension. His small body pressed closer, seeking reassurance through proximity. Who's asking? Jasmine's voice was steady. Lawyer instinct overriding maternal panic. Choi faction. They've been waiting for leverage since the dock reorganization last year. He glanced up at the buildings surrounding them. Windows reflecting afternoon sun. Any one of them could hide a camera, a watcher, someone converting this public collision into intelligence worth more than cash. This street has 17 CCTV cameras in 3 blocks, he continued. Traffic monitoring, security systems, every frame time-stamped and archived. If they're already suspicious, they're already searching footage. So we're already compromised. Not a question. An assessment. Possibly. Probably. He looked at Daniel, then back to her. In my world, sentiment is ammunition. Children are pressure points. The moment rivals confirm an heir exists, they come for him. Jasmine finished the logic with the cold precision of someone who'd studied this particular brand of violence from the inside. Leverage. Hostage. Proof you value something more than strategy. Exactly. His security detail had closed ranks now, forming a loose perimeter. Pedestrians navigated around them without conscious thought. New Yorkers conditioned to treat clusters of armed men in expensive suits as just another urban obstacle. But the exposure was complete. Manhattan's indifference wouldn't protect them. The cameras had already recorded the encounter. Someone in Seoul was already aggregating data, connecting digital breadcrumbs back to this exact intersection. Back to proof that the man who'd forbidden lineage and outlawed sentiment had both. Jasmine shifted Daniel to her other hip, preparing to move. Fight or flight calculation running behind her eyes. Why did you come back? He asked again. Different inflection this time. Not philosophical curiosity. Tactical assessment. You survived 3 years invisible. Why surface now? Because Daniel started asking questions I couldn't answer without lying. She met his eyes. And I won't raise him on lies just to keep us safe from you. The truth of it hit harder than accusation. She hadn't returned seeking reconciliation or revenge. She'd returned because integrity mattered more than survival. A principle he'd abandoned so long ago he'd forgotten it was even an option. His phone vibrated again. Text this time. Park Minjun. Message written in the abbreviated Korean they used for urgent situations. Video confirmed. 2 hours ago, someone accessed municipal camera archives for 42nd Street. Choi faction courier left for JFK 30 minutes ago. 12 hours. Maybe less before Seoul's most ruthless faction had boots on New York ground. Protection had become exposure. His presence, the very thing that should guarantee their safety, had marked them for death. Can you save someone from danger you created just by existing near them? Or does proximity to power always end the same way, with collateral damage and necessary sacrifices? And if you already know the answer, why are you still standing here? The calculation was simple. 1 phone call, 47 seconds. He'd done it before. His head of security stood 15 feet away, hand resting near his concealed weapon, waiting for the signal that would transform situation into solution. Clean.
Permanent.
Irreversible. Jasmine and Daniel could disappear into the infrastructure of New York's unnamed dead. The kind of violence that generated brief news cycles before being absorbed into the city's background radiation of tragedy. Wrong place. Wrong time. No suspects. Case filed under the weight of more urgent crimes. His empire would remain intact. The Choi faction would find nothing. No air, no weakness, no leverage. Just rumors that evaporated under scrutiny. All it required was decisiveness. The quality that had built everything he controlled. He looked at Daniel. At the boy who'd inherited his eyes and his mother's courage. At the small hand gripping Jasmine's shirt like an anchor in uncertain waters. He could see it clearly now, the exact sequence of orders, the precise timeline, body disposal logistics mapped against tidal patterns and waste management schedules, evidence elimination protocols refined through repetition. The empire demanded this. Survival required it. Every predecessor who'd chosen sentiment over strategy had ended the same way. Buried beside the loved ones their weakness had endangered. His phone was already in his hand. Park Min-jun's contact information displayed. 1 call. 47 seconds. Daniel was still watching him. Not with fear. With that same unnerving calm. As if he already understood that adults made terrible choices and children just had to survive them. Are you going to hurt my mama? The boy asked quietly. The question detonated in the space between calculation and conscience. His voice failed. Reset.
No.
Promise. Such a child's word. Promise. As if verbal contracts meant anything in a world built on betrayal and expedient truth. But Daniel waited. Serious. Expectant. And something ancient and unused shifted in his chest. Some part of himself he'd disciplined into submission decades ago when he learned that honor was expensive and survival was cheap. He lowered himself to one knee. His security detail froze. Confusion broadcasting across micro-expressions they couldn't quite suppress. Their boss didn't kneel. Not for subordinates. Not for rivals. Not for anyone. But he knelt now. Eye level with a 3-year-old whose existence violated every principle his empire was built upon. I promise, he said clearly. I won't hurt your mother. Daniel studied him with that unsettling focus. Then nodded, satisfied by some criteria adults couldn't understand. What's your name? The boy asked. The question wasn't innocent. Names had power. Identity carried consequence. In his world, names were intelligence that could be weaponized. But looking at this child, the calculation seemed obscene. Sang-hoon, he answered. Then, because the boy deserved more than fragments. But you can call me. He stopped. Father was impossible. The title required presence, consistency, the kind of commitment his life couldn't accommodate. Whatever your mother tells you is appropriate. She calls you the man who made choices he regrets. Daniel offered with the brutal honesty of children who repeated adult conversations they'd overheard. The accuracy stung worse than accusation. She's right. He looked up at Jasmine, at the woman who'd survived his decision to erase her and had somehow raised this perceptive, unervingly calm child alone. Your mother is usually right. Jasmine's expression hadn't softened. She was too smart to mistake sentiment for safety, too experienced to believe one conversation could undo years of threat. But something in her posture shifted. Fractional acknowledgement, not forgiveness, just recognition that variables were changing in real time. He stood, turned to his head of security, the man who'd executed orders without question for 15 years, who'd eliminated problems with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped questioning whether solutions were just. Stand down, he said clearly. Confusion rippled through the security detail. Stand down from what? There was no visible threat, no engagement in progress. Sir. His head of security's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone requesting clarification on orders that made no tactical sense. All of you, stand down. These people are not threats. They're not problems to be solved. They're. He paused, searching for vocabulary that existed outside organizational hierarchies and threat assessments. Under protection. My protection. Permanently. The last word hung in the air like a detonation. Permanent meant resources, meant commitment, meant prioritizing their survival over strategic flexibility. In an organization built on ruthless efficiency, permanent protection for non-operational civilians was expensive, complicated, and vulnerable to exploitation. It was everything his laws had been designed to prevent. His second phone, the encrypted line only his inner circle possessed, vibrated.
Park Min-yoon again. Urgent.
Demanding decisions that would determine whether the empire survived past sunset. He silenced it without looking. Chose the child over the kingdom. Once you make a choice you can't undo, when the empire fractures and rivals advance, when protection becomes the most expensive thing you've ever purchased, will you look at this child's face and believe it was worth the cost? Or will you spend what remains of your life calculating the exact moment everything you built began its collapse? 3 days later, the empire began hemorrhaging at midnight. Sang-hoon sat in a corporate office 20 floors above Manhattan, watching red indicators proliferate across the tablet, displaying his organizational structure. Each marker represented a severed connection. A territory ceded, an asset liquidated before rivals could seize it. Controlled demolition looked identical to collapse from the outside. Park Min-joon stood by the window, silhouette against the city lights, reading from encrypted reports with the flat effect of someone delivering terminal diagnoses. Busan shipping routes transferred to neutral intermediaries. Loss. 40% operational revenue from Southern Corridor. He swiped to the next screen. Real estate holdings in Gangnam sold below market to prevent Choi faction seizure. Loss. 800 million won, plus strategic positioning. Sang-hoon listened without interruption. Numbers that would have triggered immediate counteraction a week ago now just accumulated like debt coming due. The Baltimore distribution network voted to operate independently. They're negotiating directly with suppliers now. Park's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone reporting mutiny. 3 lieutenants in Seoul have requested temporary reassignment to other organizations. Translation: rats abandoning a ship they believed was sinking. How many personnel total? Sang-hoon asked. 47 defections. Another 120 operating under provisional loyalty pending resolution of the situation. The situation. Careful language for the fact that their boss had chosen protection of a woman and child over organizational integrity. Choi's people landed at JFK 6 hours after the crosswalk encounter, currently surveilling from a distance, waiting to see if you'll eliminate the vulnerability yourself. Park turned from the window. They're betting you will. That this is temporary sentiment that will self-correct once strategic reality asserts itself. And if it doesn't, then they move from observation to action. A child is easier to eliminate than a fortified adult. Sends the same message about your weakness while requiring less resources. The calculation was sound. Ruthless but sound. Park pulled up another file. This one made Sang-hoon's stomach tighten. The lieutenant. The one who didn't complete the Brooks termination. Park's voice went quieter. He knows he's the reason this situation exists. Choi faction found him 2 days ago. Made him an offer. Testify about the failed order in exchange for protection. What did he say? He said he'd already made his choice 3 years ago and wasn't interested in changing it now. Sang-hoon closed his eyes, knowing what came next. They executed him this morning. Seoul Warehouse District. Left the body visible as a message about the cost of mercy in our business. The man who'd saved Jasmine and Daniel, who'd chosen conscience over compliance, was dead because Sang-hoon's moment of vulnerability had exposed him. Another name for the ledger. Another debt that couldn't be repaid. I need you to do something, Sang-hoon said finally. Park waited. Relocate them. Jasmine and Daniel. Full protection detail. New identities. Sci-fi level security. That's expensive. Complicated. It broadcasts exactly the weakness Choi is looking for. I don't care. Sir. Park's professional neutrality cracked slightly. The organization is fracturing. Revenue is down 40%. Territorial control is eroding. If you divert resources to protect civilians who aren't operational assets, then we become smaller. Sang-hoon met his second's eyes. We accept diminished power in exchange for something more expensive than dominance. What's more expensive than dominance? Living with yourself afterward. Park absorbed this. 20 years of service. Hundreds of operations. Countless decisions made in service of growth, expansion, control. Now his boss was choosing contraction. Deliberately. The men won't understand, Park said quietly. I know. They'll see it as weakness. Let them. Choi will advance. Others will follow. Within 6 months, we'll control half of what we did last week. Yes. Park set down the tablet. I need to know, is this permanent? Or are we waiting for you to come to your senses? The question was fair. Brutal but fair. Sang-hoon thought about Daniel's face. About the boy asking if he was sad. About Jasmine standing in that crosswalk, refusing to run. Teaching her son that some truths mattered more than safety. Permanent, he said. Park nodded slowly. Not agreement. Just acknowledgement that orders had been received and understood. Then I'll start dismantling what we can't defend and fortifying what remains. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, the lieutenant. Before they killed him, he told Choi's people he'd make the same choice again. That some orders deserved to fail. The door closed. Sang-hoon sat alone, watching his empire contract in real time, and wondered, when you trade dominance for decency, when the throne shrinks and the kingdom fractures, when protection costs everything you spent decades building, is redemption measured by what you're willing to lose, or by whether you can survive becoming the smaller man you should have been all along? 2 weeks later, the apartment overlooking the Hudson was too quiet. Sang-hoon had purchased it through intermediaries, 1,200 square feet of neutrality with reinforced doors and sightlines his security team had approved. Temporary sanctuary while permanent arrangements were finalized. Daniel slept in the bedroom. Jasmine sat on the sofa near the window, coffee cooling in her hands, watching the river reflect city lights like scattered diamonds. He stood near the kitchen counter, neither sitting nor leaving, occupying space without claiming it. They'd barely spoken since the relocation. Logistics had filled the silence, new documents, security protocols, the machinery of erasure and reconstruction. His people were efficient. Within 72 hours, Jasmine Brooks and Daniel had ceased to exist on paper. New names, new history, new life purchased at the cost of the old empire. but the quiet between them carried weight that logistics couldn't address. "You ordered my death," Jasmine said finally. Not a question, just truth spoken plainly into the space that had been avoiding it. Sang-hoon didn't move. "I did. Not arrest. Not deportation. Not relocation." Her voice remained steady. Lawyer precision applied to facts that should have destabilized her. "Death."
Permanent érasure.
"Yes." She set down the coffee cup, turned to face him fully. No fear in her expression, just the terrible clarity of someone who'd survived long enough to demand honesty. "Why?" "Because the child threatened everything I'd built." He met her eyes.
No deflexión. No justificación.
"Because sentiment was weakness and you represented both. Because I thought eliminating the problem was simpler than confronting what it meant." What did it mean? That I'd made a mistake. The words felt foreign. Admission without strategy. That I'd let someone close enough to matter. That matching made me vulnerable in ways I couldn't calculate or control. Jasmine absorbed this, processing the logic of violence she'd already intuited but never heard spoken aloud. "If the lieutenant had followed orders," she said quietly, "if I died that night, then I would have killed my son without knowing his name." Sang-hoon's voice was bare.
No armor.
No performance. "And spent the rest of my life convinced I'd made the necessary choice." The silence that followed was heavy. Honest. The kind that existed when all pretense had been stripped away and only damage remained. "Do you expect forgiveness?" Jasmine asked.
No.
"Good. Because I can't give it." She stood, moving to the window, distance without fleeing. "You made a decision that would have erased me. Would have made Daniel grow up without a mother because his existence was inconvenient to your empire. I know. And now you're making different decisions. Dismantling what you built. Protecting us at enormous cost." She turned back. "But that doesn't undo the first choice. It doesn't erase the fact that you signed my death warrant."
No.
"It doesn't. So what are we doing here?" Her voice finally cracked. Just slightly, the armor she'd maintained for weeks showing its first fracture. "You can't atone for trying to kill me. I can't forgive you for succeeding in destroying the life I had. Daniel exists between us like evidence neither of us can escape." Sang-hoon moved closer, not invading her space, just closing the distance enough that conversation didn't require projection. "I don't know what we're doing," he admitted. "I only know that walking away now, letting you disappear again into whatever life my protection can purchase, feels like the same choice as before, just cowardice in different packaging. So you stay? Play father to a child you tried to erase? Pretend 3 years of his life didn't happen without you? I don't know how to be a father." The confession arrived unfiltered. "I only know how to be what I've been, and that man ordered your death. So maybe I stay because leaving would mean he won." Jasmine studied him, looking for deception, for manipulation, for any trace of the strategic thinking that had governed their relationship before. But his face showed only exhaustion, the kind that came from dismantling yourself piece by piece and discovering no blueprint for what came next. "He's asking about you," she said finally. "Daniel wants to know why the sad man from the street keeps sending people to protect us. What do you tell him? The truth, that you made terrible choices, that you're trying to make different ones now. That I don't know if that's enough." In the bedroom, Daniel stirred. Small sound of a child shifting in sleep. Both of them turned toward it. Instinctive, parental, the only thing they definitely shared. "Is truth enough?" Sang-hoon asked quietly. "Can it coexist with survival? Or does honesty just make everything hurt more clearly?" Jasmine didn't answer, because neither of them knew yet. When the truth is spoken plainly and no one apologizes. When damage is acknowledged but not resolved. When a child sleeps unaware of the violence that preceded his existence. Does staying become its own kind of redemption? Or just another form of the same selfishness that started this? 6 months later, Central Park in October carried the kind of light that made the city feel temporary. Gold filtering through leaves that would be gone by Thanksgiving, warmth that wouldn't survive November. Sang-hoon walked without guards. The adjustment had been harder than anticipated. His body still tracked exits instinctively, still cataloged faces in crowds, measuring threat levels his rational mind knew were no longer relevant. 20 years of hypervigilance didn't disappear just because you decided power wasn't worth the cost. But he walked alone anyway. 30 yards ahead, Daniel ran toward a flock of pigeons with the unself-conscious joy of children who hadn't yet learned that dignity required restraint. Arms spread wide, making airplane sounds, scattering birds in an explosion of gray wings and offended cooing. Jasmine sat on a bench nearby, watching with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that safety required constant assessment. She saw him approaching and nodded. Not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. The fragile détente they'd constructed over months of proximity and honesty. He's been talking about this all week, she said as Sang-hoon settled onto the bench beside her. Feeding pigeons. As if it's the most important thing in the world. Maybe it is. To him. You would have found that ridiculous 6 months ago. I found most things ridiculous 6 months ago. He watched Daniel crouch low, hand extended with breadcrumbs they'd brought specifically for this purpose. Turns out I was measuring importance wrong. The empire had stabilized at roughly 40% of its former size. Enough to maintain operations. Not enough to dominate. Park Min-joon ran most of it now. Day-to-day decisions that Sang-hoon approved remotely but rarely participated in directly. He'd become a consultant to his own organization. Present but diminished. Voluntary irrelevance. The Choi faction had tested their boundaries twice. Both times, Park had negotiated settlements that ceded territory but prevented open conflict. Pragmatic survival replacing aggressive expansion. His men no longer looked at him with fear. Some had left. Others stayed out of loyalty to something that resembled respect more than terror. A smaller operation built on different principles. He'd lost more than half his wealth, most of his influence, the certainty that his word could reshape reality through force. What remained felt lighter, dangerous in its fragility, but lighter. Daniel ran back, breathless and grinning. Did you see? I made them all fly at the same time. Very impressive, Sang-hoon said seriously. The boy studied him with that unsettling focus. Then, without warning, climbed onto the bench beside him. Small body radiating heat and energy and the particular scent of children who'd been running in autumn air. Mama says you used to be very important, Daniel said conversationally. I was. Are you sad you're not anymore? The question was so direct it bypassed deflection entirely. Sang-hoon looked at Jasmine. She watched him carefully, curious how he'd navigate honesty with a 3-year-old who'd inherited both their tendencies toward uncomfortable directness. Sometimes, he admitted, being important felt like control, like safety. Losing that is strange. But you're here now, Daniel observed with child logic that skipped past complexity to arrive at simple truth. So it's okay to be less important if you're here, right? Sang-hoon felt something shift in his chest. Not absolution, he'd never earned that and probably never would. But something quieter. Permission to exist in diminished form without treating it as failure. Yes, he said. I think it is. Daniel nodded, satisfied, and jumped down to chase pigeons again. The autumn light pressed against his face. Warm without burning. Temporary without being tragic. He thought about the crosswalk 6 months ago. About standing in that sedan, trapped behind tinted glass, watching his son for the first time and feeling the architecture of certainty collapse. About the empire he'd burned systematically, piece by piece, to purchase this moment. sitting on a park bench, watching a child feed pigeons, being present for something ordinary instead of powerful. The choice had cost everything he'd spent decades building. And sitting here now, watching Daniel's joy at making birds scatter, he realized something that would have been unthinkable months ago. He'd make the same choice again. Not because it was strategic. Not because diminished power was somehow nobler than dominance. But because Daniel was laughing, and Jasmine's shoulders had finally lost some of their perpetual tension. And for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't measuring the afternoon against what it cost to maintain. He was just here, a man in a park, watching his son discover that pigeons were easily startled and always came back. Ordinary, smaller, human, and learning slowly, expensively, without certainty of success, that maybe restraint was its own kind of power, the kind that didn't require anyone else to kneel.